Thanks for inviting me. This is a lot of fun to come out and talk, and there's several friends here in the audience too. So as Keith said, I'm working at NREL now, but I am a little different than a lot of NREL people in that I was in industry for a long time. I actually started in the oil industry. I'm a chemical engineer by training, so I've kind of gone full circle in terms of understanding energy. But for 17 years, I worked for a place called Monsanto Electronic Materials Company, which became MEMC, which then became SunEdison, and then spectacularly imploded about, 3 or 4 months ago. So in a break, maybe we can, if any of you know anything about the SunEdison story, it's kind of interesting. But silicon is my background, and of course silicon is the main conversion technology for photovoltaics. So what I'm going to talk about is actually a talk I've been giving for quite a few years now, several years even before I came out here to Colorado. So I too am a pretty hardcore climate change guy. My PhD work involved stability theory. So I got very interested in climate change in the early 90s. Jim Hansen testified in front of Congress in 1988. And it was a few years later that I became pretty interested in this. And I can tell you that I think I convinced a crazy CEO to buy a company, SunEdison, largely on the argument that climate change was going to drive crazy. That's not very fair. This is going to be taped. But a CEO, I'm not a CEO, so I kind of refer to all CEOs a little bit as different than me. But I helped convince a guy that climate change is going to drive a lot of demand for renewables, and I think that this is what we're seeing. There's a lot of things driving demand for renewables. I'll give you just a super high-level overview of NREL, but then I trust a lot of people in the audience know a lot about climate change, but it's really that intersection of really energy and how we're going to have kind of continuation of the same sort of economic growth that we've had while completely getting off carbon. This is kind of where I come from. But we'll also talk about cells. I will show the chart that Keith talked about because it's really an important chart and it's a part of the NREL history. But then ultimately kind of how we get PV as a big tool in the toolbox for carbon emission reduction. And then lastly, how we actually get to super big scale with PV. Okay, so NREL's just over the hill over there, and I'm going to keep this part super brief, but it is a special place in the national lab world. It's one of 17 national labs, and we're the only one that is stewarded by a part of DOE called Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, but it's also the only one that has a unique mission of energy efficiency and renewable energy. But it started in 1977 as CRES, as the Solar Energy Research Institute. Keith referred to the National Center for Photovoltaics. That was actually established by DOE in 1996, but in 1991, that was the year that CRE became NREL. So a lot of people around the world know NREL they know that acronym. They actually also know the National Center for Photovoltaics. We've had a big impact in the PV world, and mostly what my job is to try to continue to do that. Congressional funding is really tough. It's been tough for the last 7 or 8 years. And it's also true that PV has really grown up. So actually finding really relevant work to do that taxpayers ought to be funding, that's another tough thing. But as I'll show you when I get into this, there's plenty to do. I'm not going to go too deep on PV technology. I know that some of you, I see Dick out there, you could give a really great lecture on the physics of a PV cell, and I'm not going to go so deep that someone has to understand that. I'll try to keep it kind of light. Okay. So this is kind of a little start on what the PV program is. Like I said already, it did start as CRE in 77, but these days, actually since 2011, there's been this thing called the SunShot Initiative. And so we're really a pretty key part of that these days. And down at the bottom here are some pictures of some of the staff. This might be hard to see because there's some glare on it, I think, but the actual DOE Solar Program is kind of depicted in this little figure. There's actually 5 pieces to it. The part that I'm very involved with is photovoltaics, and Keith, was funded by that for many years. But down here, if you could see that, I don't think I can, but that should say solar thermal. So this is the concentrated solar thermal part. But then we've got these other parts: systems integration, soft costs. This is kind of all the mushy costs, if you will, of getting a PV system put in place. Things like permitting and that sort of thing. But then they added this one here too, called Tech to Market, which is really money they're spending to try to get technologies moved more quickly out into the market. Here at the bottom is that same chart that was on the cake, but I use it in this little figure, and there's no way you can see this, but this chart has literally every conversion technology that's been researched for the last 40 years, the champion cells. I don't know about every, but nearly everyone, which is why it's a very useful chart. And what we do at NREL is we actually work on, if you can see these little blue arrows, there's a bunch of them that we're actively working on today. And I just have the little arrows on ones that we have funding to work on today. But as you're going to see as I go through this talk, the lion's share of the industry is just silicon. And we've been at NREL in and out of silicon over the years. I started in 2011. I am a silicon person, so you might naturally conclude that I probably wanted to really put a lot of effort into that, and we have. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as time goes on. But in addition to researching kind of fundamental research, that is materials work and device physics work on the actual photovoltaic cell itself, we also do characterization work and we also do reliability work. These days, NREL's reliability group, which sits in my center as well, is probably one of the most well-known things we do. Keith, if you gave him enough beer, maybe he'll tell you about the lab that he ran. But that was also a very well-known lab. So the cell and module measurement or performance lab, which Keith started and ran, is internationally known, as is our reliability work. And these days, reliability is so important, as you'll see in a later slide, because in order to get the cost of these systems down and therefore get the total installations way up, you also need to think about how we're going to get the service life from not just 20 years or 30 years, but on out to like 50 years. So those are things I'll touch on later too. All right, energy and climate change. What that's supposed to be is the Earth at night. So that's a NASA image. A lot of you have probably seen it. And it's really cool if you see it on a good display, because it's a satellite image of the Earth at night, and the lights are where all the people live. And it's interesting, a lot of you may know this, but where the people live actually happens to be, most of the Earth's population, is where we have a really great solar resource. But the Earth does have a lot of people, 7.3 billion. We use a lot of electricity, and the electricity, which is responsible for most of our carbon emissions, 32 gigatons or so. Here's another version of the Earth at night, and I just want to kind of keep going. We use a lot of electricity, and 2/3 of it is generated from fossil fuels. As you're going to see later, I can never give this talk, even if it's not a group like this. I always include a number of climate change slides, because the carbon emissions problem is beyond urgent. We're at 402 parts per million, and we're going up 2 parts per million a year, roughly. So it's a really, really big deal. Because I'm trained as an engineer, but I've done really applied physics for most of my last 20 years, I always like to have papers to try to actually document something I'm going to say. And these are fairly recent papers. This one, many of you in the audience may have actually read. It came out in March, and this is the one that talked about the West Antarctic ice sheet being eroded from the bottom by warm water, and it described a mechanism for the whole West Antarctic ice sheet to drop off, like dropping ice in your martini glass in a way. But its conclusion was that just from the West Antarctic ice sheet, there's a very high probability, according to this analysis, of about 1 meter of sea level rise by end of the century, just because of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And of course, we've got Greenland, and we've got a lot of other ice around the world. And of course, there's also just expansion because of temperature. So we have all these factors going on. Another interesting paper, this one came out in May, kind of got back to something I was interested in a long time ago, which is the mixed physics models that are actually used to try to model our atmosphere. And again, there may be some deep experts in the audience, and if so, please correct me if I get anything wrong here. But I think for a layman, you can say this. A few years ago, a lot of folks in this community were hoping that the models were kind of over-predicting how bad the problem was. And it turns out to be the exact opposite. This particular paper came out in Nature Climate Change. This came out in May. And if you could, again, we can't quite see it, but there's actually gray lines right here. And those gray lines are what the old mixed physics models, what they call Earth system models, predicted. And the red ones and the darker color ones are the new ones. And the bottom line is, as these models have gotten better, as they've gotten more sophisticated and more comprehensive, the conclusions have actually gotten worse. They're far more worrisome than they were. And again, I don't want to bore you with the details of all this, but this chart over here is just the temperature anomaly charts that are fairly common. This one is a plot of just the same time scale, cumulative emissions under these different scenarios. But a pretty interesting thing this particular paper concluded is, first of all, how long is it going to take to burn all the fossil fuels, and what happens if you do? But in bold print there is what happens if you do burn it all by 2200. It predicted a mean Arctic warming of between 15 and 20 degrees centigrade. And as you guys all know, warming is latitude dependent. So this is, we're long past extinction at this point. So it's shocking if you need to be shocked anymore about climate change. So a lot needs to be done, and it needs to be done really urgently. And in fact, I'm kind of probably of the camp that we're not going to hit the 450 part per million goal, which is really embedded in the Paris COP21 meeting. This is a plot from this month of CO2 concentrations in Mauna Lea, and this is from 1980 on, and there it is for this month. And the Earth breathes, so the CO2 goes up and down because of what happens basically with forestation in the northern hemisphere. But if you could look really carefully, that peak from this summer on top of Mauna Lea is like 407 or something like that. This is the rate of increase by decade. And if you could see that line right there, it's for the previous decade, rising at 2 part per million per year. So if that's what's happening, and we're at 402 now, we're going to hit 450 by the year 2040. And so the COP21 meeting was really aimed at holding average CO2 concentrations to 450 by mid-century. So we've got to do some pretty dramatic stuff to actually make that. Well, before the COP21 meeting, this particular, there was a paper that came out by the International Energy Agency. The references are here, and you can't really read it, but this was just a special report from the IAEA, came out in the summer of last year. And what you see here is on the primary y-axis is millions of tons of oil equivalent measured just total energy, primary energy. On the right is gigatons of CO2 emissions, and years are along the x-axis. So what they said then was consistent with what I've just showed you. We've got to do some pretty dramatic things in order to meet the COP21 goals. We've got to first essentially hold overall energy consumption more or less flat for the next 25 years, and I've circled that. The green is the 450 scenario. If you're ever interested in kind of the details of what happens with energy, a really good document is this thing called the World Energy Outlook. You probably have to go to a library to read it because there's a cost to buy it, but you can read summaries for free, and there's a lot out there on the IAEA website. That scenario, the 450 scenario, has been a scenario that has been looked at for quite a few years. It's the 450 part per million scenario. And so they said a year ago, we've got to kind of turn down global energy consumption, which is really a per capita energy consumption as well. But we also have to do this. We've got to begin a major shift so that if you look over on the secondary axis, we've got to start declining in terms of carbon emissions. Even holding it flat isn't good enough. We've got to go the other way. And we've got to do that by the end of this decade. So this is kind of the basis for the rest of this story. It's about PV being very big. We all know that wind is already growing at a great pace. But when you start looking at resources, you quickly, I think, can reach the conclusion that PV is going to be the really big one, or at least it should be. And that's what this slide's about. So I stole this slide from a guy who became my friend since I've been at NREL, but I actually met him back when I was in the semiconductor industry. His name's Ike Weber. He was the director of Fraunhofer ISA. He was a professor at Cal Berkeley for many years, and at my old company, we actually funded him. But he went on to do a great thing. He grew up Fraunhofer ISA into a fabulous institution. He just retired a few months ago. And this is what a chart that he liked to show, and I stole it from him. So what I'm going to show you is basically all the finite and then renewable resources for energy on our planet. And the size of the little circles represents how much we need. So that is planet Earth, the year 2010, it requires about 16 terawatts, okay? In 2050, it's going to require like 28 terawatts. All right, so now we start with the finite resources. If you're an engineer and you're kind of geeky about units, the actual unit here is terawatt years. So this is 900 terawatt years. So you can just look at the size of the circle and say, well, we got enough coal to last for a pretty good while, but it's certainly not forever. I mean, it is finite, but there's a lot of it. That's how much petroleum. These are, heavy petroleum. Natural gas is up there. It's also pretty big. There's uranium. And if the light was good, you could see that this is kind of glowing, so this is light water fission is the way they've calculated it. So that's finite. The renewable ones are on this side. There's wind, and what's pretty cool is you can see right away that wind can power the earth. Now, when we say power the earth, when I say power the earth, we have to understand that the energy system is really complicated. Electricity is just a part of it. We use dense fuels for the vast majority of things. I mean, for industrial processes and heat, for flying our airplanes and ships and most transit. So again, you can go to a document like the World Energy Outlook and see it all broken down in all of its glory. But there's a lot of wind, and if we could convert it into the forms that we need for all of the applications that we use energy, it's enough to power our Earth. There's waves. It's not very big. This is ocean thermal. That's biomass. That's hydropower. There's geothermal. That little one right there is tides, but solar is this one. It's really big. And it really is that big. I mean, the solar constant is 1,366 watts per square meter out in space. Keith could again give us a great lecture on the solar resource. But we've got a lot of sunlight available. And of course, like I said earlier, where the people on our planet live, tends to be a really good alignment with where we have a lot of sun. And that happens to be, that's where people need food and grow crops and all that. One thing that's also important to note, if you add shale, or the discovery of shale, the fossil fuel ones get bigger, but not tremendously bigger. And that's those numbers. If you ever want this resource, this is from a professor at Cornell. His name's Perez. He produced the first paper, I think it was 2009, then a follow-up came out in, I don't know, maybe 4 years later. It's an interesting paper that this all derives from. The other thing I want to talk about is a paper that I was actually involved with, but the real authors here were graduate students at MIT. They're actually part of the fossil-free MIT group that's shut down campus a few times. They happen to be students of a friend of mine by the name of Tonio Bonacesi. And I ran a workshop in January 2015. The first workshop I had put together that was focused on PV at multi-terawatt scale, and we did it as part of a climate change meeting. Tonio was one of my panelists, and a paper came out of it. But the point of the paper is kind of interesting. I'm going to give you a lot of information about all the different things that are going to create demand pull for getting us to really big PV scale. But we also have to think about whether or not the industry is sustainable. An industry has to make enough money for investors to want to invest in it. And right now, this is a huge problem. So Tonio's group, along with NREL, have been producing a lot of good work over the last 5 years or so using a very fundamental nuts and bolts cost model, kind of a ground-up cost model to try to predict how the whole industry, the whole energy system might work. This particular paper took that on and tried to look for scenarios under which we could get to big targets. Now, again, IPCC targets is what we were striving for, right? And you go out in the literature and you try to find what these are, and it really is hard because when people talk about renewables and getting carbon out of the system, sometimes their emphasis is on nuclear, sometimes it's on wind, and it's all over the map. We concluded that between 8 and 10 terawatts is what most of the most relevant or meaningful papers conclude, and that's what we've put up here. But this paper went through this cost model, running through some scenarios, and I'm not going to go through a lot of it here because it'll just take too much time, but I want to just take you through a couple of parts of the conclusion. All right, so we ran through these cases, and what this says here, and again, what we're looking at is total capacity in terawatts by year. And if you just take current technology and run it all the way out, it doesn't go very far. For a lot of different reasons, it fails financially. If you just take the improvements that we see today and run those out, it gets bigger. I mean, this is meaningful. This is 3 terawatts, but it's still not as big as it needs to be. What about taking those line-of-sight improvements but adding to it big new efforts to reduce the capital required to build all the factories that are in the supply chain that leads to a panel, and at the same time lowering the cost of the panel. What if you do that? Well, that gets us really close. But the very interesting one is if you do all of that and you dramatically increase the efficiency of the panel, where do you get to? And that one gets us now into meaningful numbers. The last one that we did was kind of a surprise. What if you just let the industry take on a lot of debt, which is actually what's happening now? It kind of flattens out and kind of stalls at roughly 5 terawatts. Now this was an economic analysis, and I'm going to show you other slides that are going to kind of argue the same thing. And when we get to the end, the same conclusion comes out. There's a bunch of R&D work to do because we have to dramatically lower the cost of the panel. We have to simultaneously increase the efficiency of the panel, actually up to a level that we today only know how to do with a double junction or a 2-junction cell. And through all of that, lower the capital so that people can actually make the investments. There's enough money out in the system to support the whole thing. So there has been a ton of progress. I'll show it again. This particular chart that was on Keith's cake, it starts this is 1975, and if you could see all these little symbols here, there's actually a little symbol for whoever had the record. And granted, these are records. They're not what's in commercial production, but it's meaningful that it just charts out the records. And the records are always over here. There's been a lot of progress. You see that right up there at the very top, the highest efficiency you can get today is with high concentration. And I think, Keith, you're not retired so long. I think the top is still 46%. It was is it a 4-junction cell from Fraunhofer or 3-junction? I can't remember. But it's a multi-junction cell with high concentration. But 46%, that's amazing. Our group that works on these cells that they're really designed for satellites, but if you put them under high concentration, say 1,000x, 50% efficiency is just the next step. It's a device that actually has 4 separate cells because you have to divide up the spectrum. You have a cell for one part of the spectrum, the next part, the next part, and the next part. So 50% is doable. But silicon, the same silicon that we've been dealing with all along is, let me get my bearings here. It should be these right here, if I'm looking right. Yeah, it should be these filled ones. So they're not normally purple, I don't think. But it's this line. And if you look, it's been flat for a long time. Because long ago, actually, it was in Australia. It was Martin Green and a research group in Australia that figured out how to get it up to its kind of practical limit. And that's really still where we're at. The other thing that's happened is the cost of the modules have come down dramatically. Every technology, you can put together a learning curve. And so when you plot it on a log-log scale, cost of whatever it is, in this case it's cost of the panel, this is wholesale cost of the panel, as a function of cumulative shipments. So that SunShot goal we were talking about, the originally articulated goal had a panel cost number. It was 50 cents a watt. And if you look at this learning curve, it says, well, we're going to get out there. What's actually happened is we're already way past it. So when you were in college and you took that macroeconomics class and people told you that supply and demand determines price and price are disconnected from cost, it's all true. Because what's happening today, literally, module prices at the wholesale level for multicrystalline panels are now about 38 to 40 cents a watt. And everyone in the industry, all of the Chinese folks, by the way, I'm in a jacket because I met with a bunch of Chinese guys today. This is where so much of the industry is at. At NREL, we meet with them regularly. And I'm going to China in another 3 weeks to meet with another group. Everyone is bleeding money right now because no one can sustain a 38-cent price right now. But that's where it's at. Now, that's good for growth. And the Darwinian thing that happens is it causes all of these companies to accelerate everything they're doing to reduce their costs so they can survive. And that's good. It actually drives innovation forward. But it's also going to kill a lot of companies, which is not a bad thing right now. Just in Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers around the world, there's 100 suppliers. You can actually rank all of them in 4 tiers. There's 72 in China alone. There's still one major, very important supplier in the United States, SunPower. It's what's on my roof, and probably a few of you have SunPower on your roof. First Solar is the other one, and I'll show you in a minute. First Solar is cadmium telluride. They make the panels that go in big ground mount arrays. But no one can survive this price, so it's going to go up. But it's going to be this dynamic. There's a thing called the German hog cycle that depicts how commodity markets work, and we're in a commodity market. Too many players, they add too much capacity, the price collapses, and it'll keep oscillating like this. And then they all withdraw, High growth rates. PV industry right now is growing at 15% compound annual growth rate, so you can consume that capacity pretty quick, and then you have a shortage and price starts spiking back up. And then 100 people all decide they're going to make new investments, and then you have too much, and you keep doing this. You have to kill off a number of the suppliers, quite a few of the suppliers, before it's going to dampen out. I say those words because I was in the silicon wafer industry for a lot of years, and maybe in a break I can tell you what we observed, what that industry observed. Again, the company was Monsanto Electronic Materials Company. It was where all the silicon from Silicon Valley came from. And how many of you remember your first PC, when the IBM PC came out in 1984? 1984, and I had one too. The Japanese decided that all their heavy industry needed to get into silicon then. And over the next 15 years, what had been a cozy little business with only 3 players, MEMC, a German company and a Japanese company, there were 10 heavy industrial companies from Japan that came in. And they goofed up the price for the next 25 years. And no one made any money, but we all got, in the end, we all got iPhones. And basically we've got supercomputers in our pocket. But if you look at the carnage that littered the road, no one made any money on silicon materials or any of the materials in this. No one made any money on the equipment to a first approximation. Every equipment company except for Applied Materials in Silicon Valley ultimately was acquired or went out of business. It's a very, very tough business. But Apple made a lot of money. Intel, on and off, made a good amount of money. But this is how these high growth rate, high demand industries work, and PV is one of them. All right, well, let's keep going. I don't think I need to tell you this. This is from DOE, but on this side they're plotting price, and on this side they're plotting installations. And the point they're trying to make is once the price got low enough, things just took off, and that is what happened. And for a lot of reasons, it's not quite as simple as this, but I think all of us can probably thank the good hearts of the German people for the feed-in tariff law that they passed. That's what really kicked all of this off and created the first demand pull. All right, now let's talk about system prices in the United States. Just to give you some perspective, we're still in this category of how far we've gone, what kind of progress we've made. This is actually a utility system cost, and the cost is watt in dollars per watt. The SunShot goal is right there, $1. And this is where we were on systems as of about October. But we have a subsidy in the United States, and we also have a subsidy, that's the ITC, the investment tax credit. But we also have big variations in just how good the installers are and just how much sun they have. So when you actually look at the levelized cost of energy, the actual electricity cost, the equivalent goal is right there, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Look what's actually happened. We have a number that are well below the goal. And if you actually go out and look at everything that's going on our planet, this is the latest stuff. This one from May is in Dubai. That was 30 cents, and then there was another one. The lowest ones have been $2.99 and $2.91. 3 cents, under 3 cents a kilowatt hour. Many people believe that the whole southern part of the United States, the sunny part of the United States, will be able to support this kind of levelized cost of electricity probably within the next 7 or 8 years. It's really moving that fast. And so part of what you're going to hear me say as I keep going is, what kind of things change when you get electricity prices that are that cheap? And what happens in places like North Africa when you can probably get reliable PV electricity at 2 cents? That changes your whole thinking about how to situate industrial plants. A lot of you probably know aluminum smelting was put where we have hydro plants and where we have geothermal plants. Well, PV has the potential in certain parts of the world to be that cheap. And that's why I think there's a pretty strong argument for why we really are going to get to 10 terawatts. So let me keep going. So where's PV made? That's where it's made. We actually produced, this particular graph is from Paula Mintz. It says her numbers say 51 gigawatts last year. The range is between about 51 and 53-ish in terms of what was actually sold last year. But that's where it's made, China, Taiwan, and South Korea. This is the distribution of technologies. This blue one is multi-crystalline silicon. This is the crystalline one that has grains in it, that has kind of a splotchy look. The amber one is monocrystalline. That's for all of you guys that have sun power on your roof. That's monocrystal. The green one right there is actually CAD-TEL. That's First Solar. It's really the one on the very top is the purple one is SIGS. That's actually from one company that sells almost exclusively in Japan, Solar Frontier. But the green one, CAD-TEL, is actually sold all over the world. That's what First Solar is doing. And they've actually grown their little piece. and they can probably keep growing it. What's interesting about them is their efficiencies. If we were to really study that chart, the Keith Cake chart, their efficiencies have risen dramatically. And they really do represent the lowest cost of manufacture. But again, it's a thin film. That means it's got some unique issues. There's kind of some strange metastability issues that have to be understood. But First Solar is completely on top of it. And their customer is not rooftops. They're not putting this stuff on rooftops. Their focus is utility scale ground mount. Big, big plants, hundreds of megawatt sort of plants. All right. The IEA, spoke fondly of the IEA a couple of times, but I want to also actually point out how wrong they've been. This, again, is cumulative capacity as a function of year, and every year this is the IEA forecast for what was going to happen with PV. And they're always wrong, and they'll continue to be wrong. And the red one there is historical. Why are they wrong? Partly because it is really hard to predict, but also the IEA is a political organ, and it's got lots of fossil fuel interests in it. And so there's a really good guy in Paris that puts this chart together. I know him, and I think they're striving to do better, but they haven't done very good so far. So what did I say in the last thing? Many in the community are convinced that 3 terawatts by 2030 is possible. I'm going to tell you that that's kind of a minimum, and I'll show you why here in a minute. Here's actually some data from some other forecasts, and I know you can't read this, but this blue line is Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And if you follow the renewable energy space, they're a kind of a popular one to follow. This green one is the World Energy Outlook. This is that 450 part per million case. This is from their last, the latest 2016 World Energy Outlook just came out. This is from the 2015 Energy Outlook. This little dash line right there is from Energy Revolution. It's mostly sponsored by Greenpeace. And it turns out to be the only forecast that seems to be reasonable, because if you take the actual growth rate, that's this orange line, it's been 15% compounded annually for the last 6 years, and that gets us up to 2030 to about 3 terawatts again. So pretty much just extending what we've been doing, continuing that growth rate, will get us to 3 terawatts. And that's what that says. All right. I want to talk just a minute about cost. I've already mentioned that cost is a really difficult thing. On the left is splayed out over 2 years, and then here this is the same data over 5 years. But it's got the top 8 manufacturers in it in terms of cost. SunPower is not there. SunPower is high. First Solar is the red one, and as you'll see, that's this dot right here. They really are the lowest. But more interesting is what's happening with gross margin. So those of you that have had a corporate background probably understand gross margin and operating margin. At my lab, I have to define these all the time, so they're defined on the right. And operating margin actually isn't everything, because it still doesn't include cost of financing, it doesn't include taxes. But it's got a lot of important components to it. And as you see, operating margin was negative. This is in the period from mid-11 to roughly mid-13. And it's just now bobbling along at average gross margins at around 8%. And it's just barely enough to make this business make any sense, but is at least positive. This is data from the end of the second quarter, and it doesn't take into consideration that the prices just collapsed over the last 7 weeks. So this is going to go down again. It's going to go negative again. In the last 2 weeks, I've had meetings with First Solar, I've been in discussions with SunPower, and I've actually talked to the people from Jinko, which is actually now the world's biggest manufacturer. They're all very, very worried about the number of people they're going to lay off. SunPower actually has had a major layoff. They've laid off about 10% of their employees worldwide. Their CEO's taking no salary this year. But I think they're doing the right things. They're pretty much kind of preparing themselves for an extended period of these terrible prices. But again, terrible prices means a lot more PV gets put out there, so it's a double-edged sword. All right, so now talking about PV as this big tool for global carbon emissions, we had another workshop. And this one, NREL did with Fraunhofer ISA in Germany and with AIST, the National Labs of Japan. We had it in March of this year. I was one of the organizers, but what you'll see in this picture are several of my NREL colleagues. And it was really interesting because we limited it to just 20 people invited from each lab. So we had 60 of the world's most recognized experts. That doesn't mean, this was the 60 best experts, but certainly a really good collection of the world's experts here. And we focused the discussion on how to get to the multi-terawatt scale. Specifically, this chart is what we were looking at. We said this was going to be our minimum. We actually dealt with 3 scenarios. This one, 3 terawatts, the square, 5, and the top square, 10. What you see in the solid lines here are compound annual growth rates. What's it going to take to get to all of those numbers? And we've already said that this is about 15%, right? Well, the one I told you from the beginning I'm kind of focused on is that one right there. That represents 44% of the world's electricity generation in 2030, if we can get there. If you displaced all coal, that's probably going to reduce carbon emissions just alone by on the order of 40 to 45%. It's a really big deal. But it's doable. But there are a couple of things you got to know about before we get started in this kind of excited period about how big PV is going to be. That is that this is actually kind of old. This is from Ryan Weiser. He's a guy that works at another national lab at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California. This talks about an important thing that is happening already in the state of California. And that is PV electricity. Our whole electricity system without storage means that you generate it and you use it and there's no storage, right? So PV in California is producing a lot of electricity in this 8 to 10 hour time frame, actually more like an 8-hour time frame. But your usage can't be compressed into that to use it all. So as you start generating more, you have excess electricity. Remember, supply demand is at play, and so prices start falling. Companies like the one that I was involved with, SunEdison, who built big purchase power agreement sort of plants, big utility scale plants, they no longer want to put it in because now all of a sudden their asset isn't going to generate the value it's supposed to. So what Ryan's plot showed is how PV's value falls off as a function of penetration. So it's an important thing to keep in your mind because what it ultimately justifies is we have to have storage. We have to have storage in a lot of different ways. People tend to think about Tesla cars and lithium-ion batteries, but storage is a lot more than that. The cheapest and probably the most accessible form of storage immediately is going to be thermal storage, industrial, residential, small commercial building in the form of heat. Air conditioners that make ice or air conditioners that chill a heat transfer fluid. But of course, there's a lot of other things. I mean, pumped hydro is getting rediscovered because it's super useful. It has a well understood round trip efficiency. It's actually not the most efficient. But the other thing that comes out of this discussion is you start reducing efficiency in terms of its importance because you're going to lose some of these PV electrons and wind electrons. What's important is to reduce carbon emission and keep electricity or overall energy prices at a price point that economies continue to grow. So all of these, this is just a list. I'm actually going to drill kind of deeper into this one. Hydrogen is a fascinating one that I want to talk to you about. Thermal, we can talk about in a break. I don't know if Chuck Kuchar's here, but Chuck's group at NREL is a great group to talk to because they've actually invented a new air conditioning system, for instance, that actually uses a desiccant. I always love to talk about it because it's fascinating. You could have a heat pump running on your PV system that's actually keeping a big pool of desiccant charged so that it dehumidifies the air. You can actually use that dehumidification to affect sensible cooling. That's how a swamp cooler works. So these will work beautifully. At least I believe they would work beautifully in high humidity regions. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, a very humid place. And air conditioning loads have been steadily increasing. The number of months that air conditioners run throughout the year, it's steadily getting worse and worse. And this is a big deal. And PV that works in California won't work in Alabama the same way. We can have a little bit of storage that actually bridges that PV into the next day in California. You need a lot more storage in a place like Alabama because you have so much air conditioning load. So a lot of things that have to come into play, but the good news is there's a lot of good ideas. Have any of you ever heard of something called an ice bear? So ice bear, it's a bolt-on to a commercial air conditioning system. They just came out a few weeks ago. I think they called it the baby bear or some silly name. I don't want to be silly, but a name. But they basically are coming out with a residential version of this. So it's a thermal storage system. Phase change is a really important thing for storage. If we take this water and just cool it, there's so much energy goes into cooling it. But if we actually freeze it, you get a lot more benefit when you're actually going through a phase change. You can store a lot more energy. So this is a commercially available system now that you could go and put on your house, and in places like Mobile, Alabama, this actually might be a good tool to use once PV became a part of the energy system there. All right, so I want to talk about this now. What the DOE did about a year ago in preparation for something they called Beyond SunShot. There was a whole series of papers. They're all available now on the NREL website, and they're really quite fascinating. There are 8 of them that cover all these different aspects of moving way beyond the goal of the 2020 goal out towards this 2030 goal that has not been articulated. It's not official, but it's roughly a 3 cent per kilowatt hour goal. So this little exercise was done by NREL people. And it was this: how do you take the levelized cost of energy in 2015, 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and that was the real average in the United States in 2015. How do you get it down to 3? So how do you take 7 cents off of it? This articulates the research agenda for the next few years. So I know you can't read this, so I'm going to read it to you. What comes out of it is module cost, efficiency, and reliability. This is what I told you at the very beginning. And specifically, they're these. What's written right here, that bar that says 1.2, that is reducing the module price from 65 cents to 30 cents. Okay, that's price. Manufacturing cost needs to be more like 25 cents. Right now, everyone's dying because no one really has a cost below about 40 cents. And they really don't have a path to get probably below 35 because there's some big barriers in the way with silicon, and we can talk about that later too. This one here is efficiency. Get the efficiency of the module from 16% to 25%. That means a cell efficiency of about 27%. That's right at the Shockley-Queezer limit. We actually know how to do that. We actually think we know how to do both of these things. Sure. Well, that's what that first paper was all about. And if you read, it was Energy and Environmental Sciences is where we published that other one. And I would actually argue that with the right, these are research investments that industry is not going to make. There's no way they can make it. This is, I am afraid to say it, this is the role of government. And governments around the world need to make some investments in how we're going to do this. I can articulate a path for you as to how you would do it. It is possible to make a very high efficiency silicon cell. It's also possible to make a lower cost 3.5 cell. That's how I think a lot of people might want to do it.
It's just in a system sense. You're pushing 2 different ways, because if you want higher efficiency, it costs more CapEx, which you just look at that triple junction down in Fraunhofer. It's enormously expensive.
Without changing, yes, but there are some knobs you can turn, and a couple of them are pretty big. The biggest problem with 3.5s is the cost of substrate and the cost of growth. Yep. Yeah, but we do have. The point is that 3 cents isn't sustainable, and the companies have to go farther. Now, can we actually just? What if they can't go any farther at all? It's actually a good experiment. So what if you just said, all right, just everyone's going to figure out how to survive at current price points. How big can it get? That was the point, actually, of that MIT paper. But we'll say that to later, but there actually are a number of different approaches for how you would get to something like a 30% cell at it's going to be a higher CapEx and a higher cost, but because the efficiency is going to double, it's not proportional, it's not a doubling in cost. The other thing that's on this chart, though, that's kind of interesting, I'm not going to dwell on this. This is, again, for more our audiences where we go into kind of the technical nuances, but there's a lot of different things on this chart that's little bits and pieces of what you can do in silicon to improve it. Here's stuff that we can do in cadmium telluride. One of the interesting things about cadmium telluride is there were 2 Nature Energy papers that came out within a few months of each other. Something called the open circuit voltage is a big deal in CadTel, and no one had ever got it over a volt. Well, some colleagues of ours at NREL got it over a volt, and this paper came out, I can't even remember, I think it came out in February, but then some people at Arizona State did the same thing and actually got the efficiency of their device higher. This is just to underscore to those who tend to think that thin films and cadmium telluride is way behind it. It's actually not. There's a remarkable amount of work that's been done in the last 4 years to understand how to get the efficiency up, and it's actually translated into module efficiency gains at First Solar. It's one of the reasons they're doing so well. That thing I was just telling you about, this is actually here. We've developed a new technique for growing 3.5s, and it could be a really big deal. It's about 100x reduction in cost. Now that won't get you there alone because you've got to deal with the substrate problem. That's one of the big issues in 3.5s is the wafer you grow on is a really expensive wafer. But again, we'll save that to a break. You can make tandem cells. You can stick something on the top that gets another part of the spectrum. The problem we've got to solve is the silicon part. That's what this gray piece, I think my thing is dead. The gray piece is the silicon, but what's really expensive is to add a top cell that will get the other part of the spectrum. So silicon is this. We want to get the other part of the spectrum down here. That's how you can get the efficiency up over 30. We've actually, it's fairly simple. We've now made several of them, but we've got a paper coming out at NREL for a 31% device on silicon. It's a simple, good silicon cell. It's a commercial cell. But you add a top cell, and we've added 2 different kinds of 3.5 top cells, and you can boost it up to roughly 31%. Problem is, how do you make this really inexpensively? That's the challenge. And there's more about that here. This doesn't have I think it's a 30.6% record. Our last record was 29.8. But again, it's just bonding. And if any of you guys know how flash memory is made, flash memory is a bonding process, so it's really not any more complicated than that. But again, we have to be able to make the top cell. There's 3.5 multi-junctions, and the same arguments can be made for making them cheaper. But if you really look at how little investment has been made and really driving down cost, at least this is from somebody that was in industry, it's pitifully small. We've advanced the efficiency, but no one has really worked in an organized way over multiple years on lowering the cost. But the other thing I want to tell you about is what happens when you look at these bars. These are just the reliability part of this waterfall chart. This one right here is really impossible to read, but it has 2 components in it. Reducing the degradation rate from roughly 0.7% to 0.2. And then the other one is extending the service life from 30 years to 50 years. And it's a big number. 1.3 is a big part of this. The other 1.3 is over here, and that's reducing the financing costs. So if you get the bankers all believing that PV really is a solid investment, they give you lower interest rates. The reliability group at NREL is very much working on this, and there's a lot of interaction with the banking community now, just on this one. So ultimately, the only ones I didn't talk about are these 2. This is actually reducing operating and maintenance costs, and this one is reducing hardware and labor costs for installations. And the labor cost to install is still uniquely high in the United States. First Solar's cost for installing a system is dramatically lower. And so that's why it's a huge variability. The cost of a rooftop system here in Denver is dramatically different than a rooftop system in Germany. And actually California is beginning to approach rooftop installation costs in Germany. It's just a matter of having enough people with the right skills. But ground mount costs, the biggest players in ground mount have figured out how to cut their costs. So a lot of variability here, and I don't know that this is a big number anymore is my point. Okay, so the last thing in this particular section is about storage, and I go back to this chart up here. We're going to have a lot of different storage. This is out of a paper that was also in Nature Climate Change. This is in March of 2015, and in the lithium-ion battery world, this is often pointed to. This is a projection as to how long it's going to take for lithium-ion batteries to get to price points that are meaningful. This particular line right here is what the automotive industry thinks they need: $150 kilowatt. $150 per kilowatt for that system is what the automotive industry thinks will enable widespread adoption. For PV, it really isn't so simple. A lot of people like to say, well, it's 100 to 150. Turns out it really depends on what you're competing against. Like in California, when you're competing against a really expensive peaker plant, a natural gas turbine that spins up and runs just for 30 minutes, and they might only run 10% of their time in their whole service life. The electricity out of that is very expensive, so you can actually pay pretty high prices for storage and beat that cost, PV and storage. So it really depends, but the storage market is already beginning to kind of start in California. But where it really we'll know it's made it whenever you've got the Midwest, the coal-powered Midwest and the Southeast in the United States that has storage. And probably, based on some analysis that was done at NREL, probably in this period, that'll actually start to make sense. Now, the cost of PV is a big deal as well. We can come back and talk about it, but I want to throw one other thing at you before I finish this talk, and that's this slide. I'm going to talk about this here in a minute too, but it's an intriguing idea. When PV costs get low enough, when PV electricity, just imagine for a minute, it's 2 cents a kilowatt hour. If the cost of an electrolyzer, this thing here, is low enough, you can actually start producing commodity hydrogen. And for those of you that had any interaction with the chemical industry, or you have some knowledge of how fuels are produced, or if you have some knowledge of how ammonia is produced, hydrogen is a basic building block. So it's a pretty interesting idea for utilities. Right now, they sell one commodity, electricity. Hydrogen is actually a building block of a whole bunch of other things. And to take renewable electrons from wind and from PV, when the cost of those electrons is low enough, and the cost of the electrolyzer for splitting water, so water, hydrogen, and oxygen. When that's low enough, you can start doing some pretty interesting things. So this is now a big effort at NREL. It has this clever name, Hydrogen at Scale. And it's something I'm really excited about. It's a big DOE initiative. And yes, hydrogen was exciting a decade ago, but it kind of fell off of everyone's radar screen. What's been missing is some vision of how the electricity cost is going to be low enough. We can now begin to see that it really is going to be that low. So now making a big investment in reducing the cost of those things. That is, electrolyzers don't have platinum or palladium in them. And there's a lot of different chemistries that would allow water to split with pretty high efficiencies without using these very expensive metals. And so that research is going on next door over at NREL. But I want to talk about the rest of this here in a minute because it's an intriguing concept. And that's really where we're at here. Sorry, I made this move. 10 terawatts by 2030. So how do we get there? So we're back to this one. I've already said this, 10 terawatts would be 44% of the world's projected electricity needs. But I've also said this already too. Cheap PV electricity will create new demand. But I want to pause before I go there and talk about this. Someone should ask this. What kind of capital cost is it going to take to get there? Under what scenario? So this is a busy chart, but just let me walk you through it. What's plotted on the left is manufacturing capacity that needs to be added each year. What's plotted on the right is how much investment needed to produce that manufacturing capacity. So the blue line is getting us up to 10 terawatts. The red line is getting us up to 3 terawatts, okay? As a function of time, this is what we've got to do in terms of how much capacity we need every year. This was mapped out by Martin Green at UNSW in Australia, and it takes into consideration how many panels are broken before they ever get installed, how many panels die prematurely, kind of the normal end-of-service life of panels. And not a complicated calculation, but it's more than just discounting or ignoring how many panels are going to get broken or vandalized or wear out too soon. The bars talk about the investment. And so there was several scenarios. For 3 terawatts, I looked at just how much capital is needed if we only reduce the CapEx, the total amount of capital required to build the whole supply chain. There's only a 20% decline over this entire time frame. And so just to get to 3 terawatts, we need about $40 billion a year invested every year just to get to 3 terawatts. And that's not crazy at all because that's just an extension of what we're doing today. But this blue bar is what you get if we don't make any improvements beyond just like the same 20% reduction. That's a huge number. It's approaching $350 billion a year. If we can reduce the capital according to that paper I told you about, if we can reduce it by 70%, now you reduce the capital substantially so that we're now about $120 billion. And I'm just showing you this because, one, it tells you how much capacity has to be added every year, but also it puts a dollar number on it. And so that MIT paper actually was speaking to this. We have to address the capital intensity. And for silicon, the silicon supply chain starts with something called polysilicon. Polysilicon is high purity metallic silicon. It doesn't exist in nature. This is where our iPhones come from. Those devices all have silicon in them. But that polysilicon is then converted into an ingot, either a single crystal ingot through a process called Czochralski crystal growth, or a multi-crystalline ingot, which uses a technique called Bridgman growth. But you grow an ingot, then you slice it up into wafers. And when you slice it up into wafers, no matter how thin you can make the little wire, we use something called wire saws to do it, you waste half of the silicon, half of it. Further, we make a wafer, just because they break if they're much thinner than this, we make a wafer that's about 150, 180 microns thick. For silicon, you really only need about 50 microns. So if you could just figure out how to no longer slice it and waste half of it and only get the absorber thickness you need, that alone would get us to this 70% reduction. It's called kerfless wafering, and we haven't figured it out yet, or we haven't settled on a technique yet. And one of the reasons we haven't is there's been very little DOE investment in this. Most of the investment has come from venture capitalists. And if any of you in the audience have ever dealt with venture capitalists, some of you may be venture capitalists, who knows, but venture capitalists aren't in for a very long run. I mean, they need to exit 3 years, maybe 5, and that's what happened with all of the kerfless wafer investments that they made around 2007, 2008. They could see that they weren't going anywhere, and they backed out of all of them. So all these companies with a really cool idea failed, except for one. And we can talk about that one here in a little bit. But there's a lot of things that could be done if there's investment in the right things. This is at least my belief. So I've already talked about this. That is new loads. So where are these new loads going to come from? Think about things that the world needs that actually have electricity as a major part of it. Fresh water is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. It's a climate change-driven problem. But we're talking about desalination, but also just purification of water. A lot of the world just has terrible sanitary systems. So a lot of folks now are looking at how to desalinate water basically with daytime PV electricity. And it is going to raise the cost. But again, if you don't have to have a coal-burning power plant driving your desalination plant, and with reductions in the cost of the desal plant, these begin to make more and more sense. And so there's a lot of interest in it right now. So here we go. 700 million people don't have access to clean water, so there's a big demand pull there. Air conditioning. I've already talked a little bit about air conditioning, but just shifting air conditioning. There's a couple of different ways to say this. I want to say it right. Much of the world doesn't have air conditioning now, and the world's getting hotter. All right? Just take a trip to Australia, and you find that a lot of Australia doesn't have air conditioning. Take a trip to Latin America or to Africa. A lot of the cities do not have air conditioning, or not very good at air conditioning. They need air conditioning. They're going to add new load. But the other part of this that is not categorized there is what can we do by redesigning air conditioning so that it's uniquely kind of coupled with PV. Okay. So these are really small versions of numbers. These numbers, by the way, came from a graduate student that we were working with at MIT from Denmark. And he did some really cool calculations, but they're on the very low end of something with a pretty big bar. I'm going to skip all that. Electrification of vehicles. And you guys probably all have your own estimate for what electrification of vehicles could be, but it's at least 2.5 terawatts. That's just 50% of the world's cars, personal vehicles, that would amount to this. And then there's hydrogen and synthetic fuels. So I've just added up right there, 8.5 terawatts, just with this. And that's not even talking about replacing existing fossil. This is just new load that it could preferentially use PV. Okay. And of course, there's other things. You still have 1.2 billion people that don't have electricity at all. Another roughly 2 to 3 billion people that have unreliable electricity. So we need microgrids and a lot of electrification, and PV is ideally suited for microgrids, especially in Africa. Data centers. A lot of the big owners of data centers are interested in using PV, even, of course, with electric storage, but at least using PV to run the daytime part of it, because that load does tend to go with when people are up and working. And then reengineering of industrial processes is what I want to talk about next. So back to this. This is that same hydrogen thing. And so if you can imagine a world where we're making hydrogen, I want you to look at some of these things. Metals refining is over here. It uses a lot of hydrogen. But here's ammonia again. And ammonia can be a fuel. It turns out, ammonia today is the biggest, the commodity that uses the most amount of fossil fuels. We produce hydrogen from methane, so we reform methane. So you end up getting hydrogen, but you end up producing a ton of carbon dioxide. It's used for agriculture. It's used all around the planet. And so there are a lot of interesting ways to use PV to make ammonia. Hydrogen can be used to react with CO2 to make synthetic fuels. Hydrogen can be used to upgrade biomass to make dense fuels. And, when you think about biofuels and you want to convert it into jet fuel, you need hydrogen, but you don't want to use methane to make your hydrogen. You want to use something else. This whole plot is kind of interesting in that you've got solar up here, wind, all making electricity, nuclear making electricity, concentrated solar thermal. Some of that electricity is going to be stored in a battery, but a lot of it could be rerouted over here to make hydrogen. And hydrogen becomes a commodity that feeds all these other things, but some of that hydrogen can go right back into making electricity through a fuel cell. Hydrogen, of course, can be used directly in cars. And a lot of you probably know about what Toyota is doing in the state of California with the Mirai coming out, and a big emphasis on hydrogen vehicles. At NREL, I think we've got 6 hydrogen cars running around at any time, and we've got 3 or 4 fueling stations. It's pretty interesting what's possible when the cost of electricity is cheap enough and the cost of the electrolyzers are cheap enough. But this is another crazy idea related to this, but no one's modeled this, no one's done this. This is actually kind of the brainchild of me and another center director at NREL. But it's kind of a teaser. So think about, what if we decided we've got to get carbon off the system right away? The whole world decided that we're going to take the Clean Power Plan and basically make CO2 emissions illegal. If you've ever thought about carbon capture and sequestration, again, this is kind of the chemical engineer in me. It happens that a good friend of mine ran the largest university-based clean coal project, what was so-called clean coal project, at the university that I did my graduate work at, which was Washington University. This project was funded by Peabody Coal. Great guy ran this project, a great team was on this project. And one of the first things you realize is you don't want to burn air when you're trying to separate the CO2. You want to burn oxygen. So you need pure oxygen, because then all you got to do is separate CO2 and water. And that's a really easy separation. If you burn air is 80% nitrogen. You've got all of these other compounds to deal with. So what if we took all of our natural gas production, like in California, you've got a combination now of natural gas jet engines, these turbines, these fast spin-up turbines that come up. These are the peaker plants. And then they provide the electricity until the combined cycle plants get back up to speed. That's within this little box up here. What if you used PV to make oxygen and nitrogen? This is a very simple process. This is how Air Products makes the liquid nitrogen that they bring to the hospital. And I worked in one of these plants a long time ago. So that's a source of oxygen. What if we also were splitting water with another PV array? This can make hydrogen that we can use on the previous side, and we can sell it. But then we've got more oxygen that we put in a big tank, and that oxygen is made through the daytime, and that's what is fed to our natural gas combined cycle plant at night. And then the separation from CO2 and water is simple, and we liquefy the CO2 and we put it in a really deep hole. That's the whole idea there. And a lot of us don't like that idea, but this is going to happen. Further, this whole idea involves other commodities. So the owner of this plant is selling electricity from PV, but they're also selling commodity hydrogen, they're selling commodity ammonia, they're supplying electricity 24 hours a day, and they're putting all the CO2 in a hole with a process that's actually manageable. I think ideas like this are also going to start getting pulled out of us now that PV, there's a vision for how PV is going to get this cheap. And I've mentioned SunPower a couple of times. SunPower is a very interesting company, and they do these big PV arrays. A friend of mine is a vice president of systems there, and I was talking to him about this when he was out at NREL a couple of weeks ago. And not necessarily this idea, but variations on these ideas are actually beginning to get thought about in North Africa. I have a regular phone call with a group in Morocco that is very interested in the idea of making hydrogen from desalinated water in Morocco using very cheap PV that could be produced there in North Africa in the not-so-distant future. The Japanese, as part of our workshop, we had a Japanese contingent. They translated a paper, or gave me a translation of a paper for kind of a really crazy idea that was, the paper was produced about 3 years ago. After Fukushima Daiichi, 25-ish gigawatts of nuclear power went offline. Electricity prices are very expensive in Japan. My old company, I used to make 2 to 3 trips a year to Japan, to the prefecture just below Fukushima. So I kind of know this place a little bit. It's about 28, 29 cents a kilowatt hour now. The paper they produced was this: go to North Africa, make hydrogen with PV, liquefy it, put it in a tanker, an ocean-going tanker, bring it back to Japan, convert it to electricity in a fuel cell, and they did all this elaborate cost analysis, and they said that they could still sell the electricity with a 2-cent per kilowatt hour profit. So that's because their electricity is so bloody expensive. And so we tend to think in the United States that the rest of the world has our problem, and they don't. Energy prices are a lot higher in the rest of the world. But as PV gets really, really cheap, a lot of the rest of the world is going to wake up to interesting things you can do, maybe things like this. All right, in the end, a lot of stuff that was in this came from other people. I think I've talked about them as we went, but I'll just leave that up there, and I put up a picture of NREL, and I think we're now done.